buried in the deepest vaults of human memory, a nightmare persists, stirring each time the wind dares whisper a single name, a name the iron hooves of the Mongol horde branded upon the brow of every civilization they touched. They were annihilation itself given breath and bone, a nation of armored thunderbolts who transformed from the frozen steppes of Mongolia into the architects of the largest empire the scarred face of this earth has ever endured. Genghis Khan was not a commander in any familiar sense. He was a doctrine of organized extinction, a man who forged methodology from terror and a diplomatic protocol written entirely in the dark currency of blood and ash. When Baghdad fell in the year 1258, no mere city was erased. The very heart of the world went dark. 5 centuries of luminous civilization were extinguished, and the waters of the Tigris ran black with ink and thick with the crimson of the slaughtered. Hulagu stood upon the balcony of history and watched the smoke ascending from the caliph's golden domes, never knowing, in the towering arrogance of his conquest, that his true defeat had not yet begun, that the greater war was only drawing its first breath. In that precise moment when the conqueror believed he had toppled Islam as one topples a wall, Islam was quietly forging a weapon of an entirely different order, a weapon no hand could carry, born only by the soul, sharpened not on stone, but on iron faith. It is the great irony of military history, proven across the centuries without exception. The most ferocious of conquerors were never merely invading cities. They were marching, unknowing, straight into the abyss of their own undreamed transformation. The Mongol sword that severed the necks of caliphs and shredded the volumes of wisdom was, without comprehension, digging its own identity's grave and laying the cradle for a rebirth that no historian, no conqueror, no oracle could have foreseen. This is not merely a chapter in a documentary series. This is testimony to the strangest law governing the rise and fall of civilizations, the law which states that a true civilization does not die when it is defeated, but is reborn when it swallows its defeater. Bring your full attention to what follows, for today we will not narrate the story of a single battle or a siege. We narrate the hardest victory in all of recorded history, a victory in which not one spear was leveled and not one trebuchet was fired. We will narrate how a people slain upon the field of battle died only to be reborn inside the very hearts of their conquerors. How the call to prayer silenced above the domes of Baghdad rose again above Mongol war tents, above the far hills of Mongolia itself, above the courts of the Ilkhanate. Contemplate with me the paradox so vast it freezes the blood in the veins. The man who burned the greatest library in Islamic history, his own grandchildren, 3 generations hence became among the greatest patrons of Islamic scholarship the world has ever known. This was no miraculous intervention descending from heaven in an hour of weakness. It was the inevitable harvest of a civilization which carried within its very core an irresistible gravitational force, one that answered the questions which swords, no matter how sharp, can never answer. The civilization that answers the question of why will always devour the civilization that only masters the question of how, and this is precisely what unfolded when the Mongol pragmatic mind collided with the spiritual depth of Islam, rooted in the ancient bedrock of human nature. And while the Khan sat counting plunder in his tent, dividing conquered lands among his captains, the patient Muslim merchant sat quietly reciting scripture, and the Muslim scholar teaching small children letters of a language that never broke with the walls that broke around it. This is the 15th and final episode of History Legion, a series that began with the Mongol annihilation machine in the cold Mongolian dark and ends with the greatest non-military conquest in the history of all invasions, when Islam opened the conqueror who had closed every door. Sit and listen well, for the story you are about to receive does not live in books of military victories. It lives in the books of destiny, in the ledgers written by Providence with a pen heavier than all the swords of the Mongol horde, more enduring than every wall of every fallen civilization. Today, we speak of the greater war, the war of soul against iron, of the word against the arrow, of civilizational memory against pure and hollow nihilism, the war in which the man who believes himself defeated emerges victorious, and the man who believes himself triumphant walks unknowing into the abyss. Let us begin with Hulagu Khan himself, the man who burned Baghdad and executed the last Abbasid caliph, for even this figure, who embodied the very face of Islamic ruin, was never beyond the gravitational pull of the civilization he came to fold into darkness forever. Hulagu's most favored wife, Dox Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian of immense influence within his court, but the story did not end with Hulagu himself. It began anew with his own son, Ahmad Teguder, who raised the banner of Islam above the Ilkhanate tent and composed his royal letters entirely in Arabic. Ahmad Teguder, the Mongol Khan who declared his Islam in 1282 and addressed the Mamluk Sultan Kalawon as "my brother in faith," was the first bell in the great chain of transformation, the bell that stirred the Mongol conscience from its long slumber amid blood and plunder. Yet Ahmad Teguder did not complete the journey. He was overthrown by the pagan Argun, and the Ilkhanate court stumbled once more between faiths and identities. But the seed had been planted in a soil destined to bear fruit when its fated season arrived. The season arrived with Ghazan Khan, a man who inherited the Ilkhanate throne in 1295 at the age of 30, carrying in his soul a hunger that no treasury of gold could satisfy, and no 10,000 war horses prepared for hunt and battle could ever still. Ghazan Khan, the most formidable of Hulagu's descendants, declared his Islam under the Sufi master Sadr al-Din Ibrahim and commanded the demolition of Buddhist temples and synagogues, raising mosques upon the very ground where the gilded idols of Buddha had towered and watched the world with hollow stone eyes. Ghazan's conversion was not merely the Islam of political calculation. It was the Islam of a man who found within its civilizational architecture the answer to the question that had long tormented him: how does one govern an empire containing more peoples than the steppes contain, blades of bitter winter grass? In the moment Ghazan embraced Islam, he transformed from warrior into builder, raising in Tabriz a complete civilizational complex: mosque, madrasa, library, asylum for the mentally afflicted, and an observatory, as though atoning with his own iron hands for the sins his ancestors pressed into the dust of Baghdad. Rashid al-Din Fadlallah, the encyclopedic vizier who governed Ghazan's intellectual kingdom, wrote in his reign the Jami al-Tawarikh, the first comprehensive universal historical encyclopedia, composed in Arabic and Persian by a Mongol minister seeking to chronicle the civilizations of the entire known world. Consider for a moment the staggering reversal. The very Ilkhanate that burned the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and cast its manuscripts into the Tigris rebuilt the House of Wisdom in Tabriz and furnished its scholars with gold, time, and the full protection of imperial authority to write whatever their minds could conceive. This was no isolated exception within the Mongol Khanates. It was a repeating pattern across the full breadth of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the China Sea to the edges of the Mediterranean. The conqueror rules, but it is the conquered who ultimately rules the conqueror. The Golden Horde upon the Russian steppe and the banks of the Volga. Ibn Battuta visited and recorded his astonishment that Mongol tents rang with the call to prayer, that the Mongol Khan attended Friday prayers, and that Arabic had become the language of formal ceremony in the Golden Horde's court of power. Burkhan, whom we encountered in the 9th episode, was the defining landmark of this transformation within the Golden Horde, the man who embraced Islam of his own sovereign will, who warred against his own cousin Hulagu in defense of the Islamic world, and who made of the city of Sarai a capital teeming with scholars and men of God. And when Uzbek Khan rose, who ruled the Golden Horde across the 14th century, he declared Islam the official doctrine of the Khanate, suppressed the ancient Mongol paganism with a fist of iron, and raised mosques upon the rubble of the old Mongol frontier checkpoints, consecrating the earth anew. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the very heartland of ancient Mongolia, the direct inheritance of Genghis himself, followed the same inexorable arc, until Samarkand and Bukhara, devastated by Genghis, became blazing centers of Islamic learning sought by scholars from every distant and wind-battered corner of the earth. In less than 100 years after the fall of Baghdad, Islam had opened from the Mongol Khanates what neither the Umayyad sword, nor the Abbasid, nor the Seljuk had ever opened: the hearts of the men who sat upon the highest thrones the earth had to offer in their age. This is the civilizational logic that military commanders alone cannot comprehend, for a military conquest may be opened by the sword and closed again by the sword. But a civilizational conquest cannot be closed, because its weapons are invisible: language, doctrine, morality, and the terrible beauty of aesthetic grandeur. Study the map with care. In the year 1260, a quarter of the earth lay beneath pagan, Buddhist, or Nestorian Mongol dominion. By the year 1400, most of that same map had become Islamic. Not through a single bloody campaign, but through a quiet recitation, an honest trade, and the weight of a jurisprudence that answered questions swords could not. We arrive now at the most breathtaking chapter of this entire epic, the chapter in which the great civilizational transformation manifested in its most colossal material, architectural, and imperial forms. The age we call the Age of the Inheritors, the age when conquerors became builders. Timur ibn Taragai was born in 1336 in the city of Kesh near Samarkand, of a Turkic mother and a father tracing lineage into the Mongol Barlas tribe, carrying in his blood the ferocity of the steppe and the theological discipline of Hanafi Islam and the deep longing of Eastern Sufism. Timur was not merely a conqueror. He was a man who knew precisely what he wanted, with a clarity that bordered on the terrifying, to rebuild the Mongol Empire, but beneath the banner of Islam, to restore the glory of Genghis, but with the Quran in one hand and the iron sword in the other. Timur's visible face, a conqueror without mercy, who toppled entire cities and erected from the skulls of his enemies pale towers that bleached beneath the merciless desert sun. And this face is real, undeniable, recorded in the chronicles with an ink that refuses to dry. Yet Timur's hidden face, the one obscured beneath the centuries of blood and ruin, is the face of the man who rebuilt Samarkand from absolute desolation into the greatest city in the Eastern world. A magnet for scholars, poets, mathematicians, architects, and astronomers from every civilized corner of the earth. The Bibi Kanyam Mosque in Samarkand, whose twin minarets were reputedly the tallest in the Islamic world at their completion, was a monument of symbolic atonement for the mosques his ancestors had burned in Baghdad, as though the inheritor was repaying in stone and mortar what the ancestor had stolen in fire and ruin. The great university of Samarkand in the age of Timur's descendants, and above all in the reign of Ulugh Beg, the astronomer prince who preferred the observatory to the battlefield, became the most formidable astronomical institution in medieval Islamic history, rivaling the golden academies of Alexandria in their most radiant epoch. Ulugh Beg, Timur's direct grandson, built his legendary madrasa in Samarkand and consecrated his life to calculating stellar positions with a precision that surpassed European astronomers by a century and a half. His star tables were still being studied in European lecture halls 200 years after his death. Consider this single image: the man crouched in his subterranean chamber, mapping the architecture of the stars, calculating the distance of the sun with an accuracy unknown to his age. This man was the grandson of a city breaker, the inheritor of Hulagu, direct descendant of the army that buried Baghdad in ash. The Mongol blood discovered in Islam what it could never find in slaughter: a purpose grander than plunder, an ambition nobler than dominion, a civilizational project worthy of raising palaces instead of destroying them, of spending gold upon manuscripts instead of upon swords and the shafts of arrows. And in the 16th century, we arrive at the absolute zenith of this astonishing journey, when Babur, grandson of Timur through his father and of Genghis Khan through his mother, crossed the stone ramparts of Afghanistan and descended into the vast and ancient plains of the Indian subcontinent. Babur, the man who composed poetry in the intervals of battle, who convened literary salons in the aftermath of slaughter, who felt within his depths a lineage that united Islamic rigor with Eastern lyricism and the Timurid obsession with the architecture of beauty, laid the foundations of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal state in India, what the English called the Mughal Empire, itself a corruption of the word Mongol, was in truth the civilizational project that fused the Mongol inheritance with the Timurid spirit, the Islamic root, and the extraordinarily fertile soil of the Indian subcontinent's ancient and layered culture. And in the reign of Babur's third direct grandson, Jalal al-Din Muhammad Akbar, the civilizational project reached its first great zenith, a Muslim Mongol emperor governing more than 100 million souls, unleashing a project of religious tolerance and weaving a composite civilization without parallel in any known age. Shah Jahan, whose very name translates as King of the World, was at once the last great warrior and the supreme builder. A descendant of Genghis whose blood had merged with Persian and Turkish and Islamic currents across generations, building for the woman he loved a crown wrought from imperishable white marble. The Taj Mahal at Agra, that white silence standing upon the banks of the Yamuna, is not merely a tomb, nor a palace, nor an architectural monument. It is the most eloquent witness to the entire journey of Mongol blood from the steppes of Mongolia to the pinnacle of Islamic beauty on a distant and ancient continent. From the Mongol war tent to the dome of the Taj Mahal, 3.5 centuries. From iron hooves churning the waters of the Tigris to white marble reflecting the moonlight in the hushed silence of Agra. 3.5 centuries. That is how long it took Islam to conquer the heart of its conqueror, the Ottoman Empire, which inherited the Islamic dream and shielded the Levant from final annihilation after the star of the Mamluks had dimmed, carried in its own veins something of that same Turco-Mongol blood, long since melted and reforged in the furnace of deep Sunni Islamic civilization and doctrine. The message is clear as the light of early dawn to any who look with patience. Islam is not defeated when its books are burned, for its books are carved upon the chest before they are pressed upon the page. Not defeated when its mosques are destroyed, for the truest mosque is the heart that remembers God in the deepest hour of subjugation. And this great civilizational paradox forms the iron core of everything this episode is built upon. The Mongols won nearly every battle and lost the war. The Muslims lost nearly every engagement across a century and a half and won the war. The question that remains is simply how and why. There exists a strategic lesson that repeats itself across the centuries with the regularity of the rising sun, a lesson no ruler absorbs until he is broken by it, and no victor teaches until he has cause to mourn it. We call it the law of the consumed conqueror. The Byzantines in Egypt, the Arabs in Andalusia, the Ottomans in Byzantium, the Mongols across the House of Islam, the English across the vast subcontinent of India, all entered by force, believing themselves conquerors, and departed after generations having been shaped far more profoundly by the land they seized than they ever shaped the land themselves. Why does this happen? Ibn Khaldun, the Arab intellect without equal in dissecting the deep anatomy of historical phenomena, argues that a group of high communal solidarity conquers, but loses that solidarity upon achieving the soft luxury of governance, becoming brittle before a civilization of greater complexity and depth. Yet in Islam's case, the process exceeded Ibn Khaldun's framework entirely, for Islam did not wait for Mongol solidarity to weaken. It descended into that solidarity and ignited it from within, transforming the raw energy of conquest into the disciplined energy of construction without dulling its terrible edge. Islam did not tell the Mongol warrior, "Lay down your sword and become something meek." It said, "Carry your sword, but carry it in the service of something worthy of the blade." And therein lies the essential distinction between a doctrine that suppresses human ferocity and a doctrine that consecrates and directs it. There is also the social factor that grand historical narratives habitually overlook: the Muslim merchants. These anonymous figures, who appear in no book of military victories, were the truest soldiers of the War of Transformation, carrying their trade goods in one hand and the biography of the Prophet in the other. The Muslim merchant seated within the Khan's tent, selling silk and performing his prayers with a quietude unruffled by the glitter of Mongol gold or the ringing of Mongol iron. He opened more of the Khan's heart than 1,000 regiments, 100,000 cavalrymen, or the mightiest walls of any caliphate or emirate. The Muslim woman who married a Mongol prince, the Muslim tutor who taught the Khan's sons the sciences and the ethics of a higher order, the Muslim physician who dressed the Khan's wounds after battle. These three figures unlocked doors that 1,000 lances and 100,000 swords could never have forced. The law of the consumed conqueror does not operate in a vacuum. It operates only when the defeated civilization possesses something the conqueror desperately lacks, an answer to the question, why are we here? And that answer is the essential raw material of every civilization that aspires to survive and to endure. Islamic civilization possessed that answer in its most complete and profound expression. A total architecture of existence encompassing God and man, nature and society, reason and spirit. A system that leaves no void in the human soul unfilled, no question of ultimate meaning without a considered and resonant response. In contrast, what did ancient Mongolian civilization possess as a civilizational system beyond the sword, the horse, and the worship of the eternal blue sky? Enormous power upon the open battlefield, and a hollow emptiness in the halls of meaning, and it was precisely that hollow emptiness into which Islam descended, slowly and irreversibly. As for the second great question we posed at this episode's opening, why do some civilizations vanish forever while others rebound from apparent death? Its answer lies in grasping the fundamental difference between a civic civilization and a cultural civilization. The civic civilization, that which is built upon cities, markets, canals, and palaces, falls when its walls fall, and dies when its king dies, because everything within it is born upon a material architecture that cannot withstand the Mongol trebuchet or the weight of advancing iron columns. The cultural civilization, that which is built upon the sacred text, the language, the creed, and the collective memory, does not die with the death of cities, for it does not live in stone but in the chest, not in a library but in the memory, not in the palace but in the poem that outlives all palaces. Islam was, in its very essence, a cultural civilization of the highest order. It was not an Abbasid caliphate that could be burned, nor a material wall that could be broken, but a text carved upon the breast that cannot be erased, a language upon the tongue that cannot be silenced, a faith in the heart that no sword, however sharp, can ever uproot. And so when Baghdad burned, Islam did not burn, for Islam was not in Baghdad alone. It was in Cordoba and Samarkand, in Granada and Delhi, in Cairo and Timbuktu and Malaya, and in 10,000 villages whose names not one of Genghis Khan's descendants could have recited. And from this truth emerges the single most important strategic lesson of this entire series, a lesson addressed to every civilization under threat and every nation standing upon the edge of the abyss. Memory is the greatest weapon, language is the most impregnable fortress, and faith is the deepest trench. The nation that guards its language in war, its sacred text in catastrophe, and its identity in defeat, shall not perish, no matter how long the iron night endures, no matter how heavy the shadow of the conqueror's wings falls across its grieving sky and across the ruins of what was once radiant and alive. We arrive now at the moment every viewer who has followed the series from its very first episode has been waiting for. The moment where every thread converges, where the complete tableau is finally revealed in all its terrible depth, its color, its vast and aching blue like the Tigris before it ran black. Remember the first episode, Genghis Khan forging his annihilation machine upon the Mongolian plain, threatening the world with oblivion, dispatching the vanguard of his armies like a black wind that burned everything in its path, making no distinction between the scholar and the ignorant, the child and the man. Remember the fourth episode, the Caliph al-Mustazin wrapped in a carpet, the Tigris black with the ink of manuscripts and crimson with the blood of scholars. That day the victor believed he had silenced the voice of Islamic civilization, once and for its last and final time. But episode 15 answers, al-Mustazim died and Islam endured. Baghdad burned, and Samarkand blazed, and Agra rose, and Istanbul crowned herself, and Cairo stood, and Timbuktu sang, and Jakarta lifted her minarets toward the sky, in every city where the call to prayer still tears the dawn apart with its sovereign voice. Consider with a certain dark wonder the following image. The tomb of Hulagu in Iran stands within meters of the mosques raised by his own converted successors, as though history has always loved this precise species of exquisite and agonizing contradiction, placing destroyer and devotee forever, side by side in the same cold earth. and the tomb of Timur in Samarkand rests within the Gore Amir, an Islamic monument of breathtaking beauty, counted among the supreme architectural masterpieces of the Islamic tradition and inscribed upon his sarcophagus in Arabic, "Were I to rise, the very earth would tremble beneath my tread." And the man who built the Taj Mahal, Shah Jahan the Mongol, inscribed upon the great gateway of the mausoleum verses from the Quran's Surah al-Farj, as though affirming in the most effusive that's bad not the verse be. When the Mongols embraced Islam, they did not lay down their swords. They carried those same swords in the service of Islam and opened with them territories the original Arab conquerors had never reached. India in all her depths, Central Asia in all her wealth, the vast cold plains of Russia in all her endless frozen breadth. And so the man defeated in battle became the conqueror in the greater war. Islamic civilization lost Baghdad, a transient political capital, but gained in its place dozens of luminous centers: Samarkand and Herat, Tabriz and Sarai, Agra and Lahore, and city after city stretching beyond the horizon of any map. The great scholar Marshall Hodgson wrote in his encyclopedic work that Islamic civilization in the 15th century was broader in its reach, richer in its diversity, and more vividly alive than it had ever been at the very zenith of the Abbasid Caliphate, this 200 years after the burning and the killing and the annihilation. This great civilizational paradox destroys forever the doctrine of the impossible resurrection and declares with a voice that shakes the walls, civilizations defeated militarily but which endure culturally cannot be measured by the scale of the destruction they have suffered, but only by the depth of their roots in the bedrock of human nature. And the final lesson, the one we offer at the close of this series to every viewer who still asks what anything means in an age when the modern conquerors appear to possess every weapon of destruction, and when the targeted civilizations stand alone in the howling storm, surrounded by the gathering dark. The lesson is this: time is a civilizational weapon, patience is a strategy, language is a trench, faith is a fortress. And the nation that preserves these four things in the darkest hour of its breaking will never be defeated forever, but will be reborn in the exact season that destiny has already appointed in its own inscrutable ledger. The Mongols believed that Baghdad was Islam, and so they destroyed it. But Islam proved it was not contained within any single city, nor within any single caliph, nor within any library that burns, nor any wall that crumbles, but within every heart that ever spoke the testimony of faith and wept with the weight of true belief. This series has been a journey through 15 episodes, through the fiercest of battles, through the deepest of defeats, through the strangest of victories. But this final episode is the most beautiful of all, for it delivers this one truth: the ending was not a sunset over smoking ruins, it was the dawn. History Legion closes its long journey today with this eternal truth carved upon the face of time, without hesitation or doubt. Islam conquered the conqueror, swallowed the destroyer, and transformed the annihilation machine into a workshop of civilizational creation. And this, by any measure of history, is more wondrous than any legend ever told. Now that the final page of this vast and blood-soaked book of dust and ink has been turned, I ask you to stand for a single moment before the complete tableau, before the painting that history composed in colors no human artist has yet been able to name or to replicate upon any canvas. In the first image, a Mongol tent upon a barren plain, fire defying the absolute dark of the steppe night. Genghis Khan pointing a finger at a stolen Persian map, tracing with one iron hand the routes of conquests yet to come, writing destiny in blood before the scribes have had time to dip their pens. And in the final image, a white minaret ascending toward the deep blue Indian sky, the muezzin releasing his voice across the vast breadth of a continent, in Arabic, on Indian earth, built with Mongol gold, and beneath that minaret the inheritors sleep, unknown to the ancestors of the very army that first raised the sword. Between these two images lie 3 centuries of blood and faith, of defeat and resurrection, of the sword and the sacred text, of conquest and the transformation no conqueror ever writes into his battle plan. And that is the complete story we have narrated together across this series, from its first dark frame to its last. And this story has not ended, because it never ends. As long as there remains in the world a single man who believes that civilization is stronger than the sword, as long as there remains a single nation carrying its book through the storm, as long as a single call to prayer rises above a small village lost in the dust. This has been your 15th episode of History Legion, the finale that rewrites the very definitions of victory and defeat from their deepest roots, reminding you that the greatest triumphs in all of history were never recorded in documents of surrender, but in the transformation of identity, and in the word of monotheism spoken by a tongue that yesterday was raised in praise of idols.